Well, I would say that we did see the noticeable impact of Huawei's shipments over the past couple of years, right? 2019, they were doing great with smartphones. Yeah. Like almost 40% share in, in China in the high-end market, above $600. And, but then as a lot of these policies came into play, they couldn't get 5G chips anymore. They couldn't produce their own 5G chips either. And so they really started to go downwards and started to run out of supplies. Now, that's why this most recent phone is such a, whoa, what happened? How did they suddenly get these chips, right? Yeah. And so beyond just that processor, which allegedly SMIC in China helped them produce, but also as some companies have done teardowns of the product, as they took the product apart realizing, oh, they're memory components from SK Hynix in South Korea, right?
Exactly.
But, and SK Hynix says, but we never sold it to them, right? So there's like workarounds, presumably, that somehow came into play here.
But, so in this whole export ban that we've seen from the U.S., coming out of the U.S., there has been a one-year exemption that SK Hynix and Samsung have received for chip supplies to China. And so it's not like they're not doing business at all.
True.
So I don't know where the surprise element comes from.
Yeah, well, and even Qualcomm, right? Technically, they did get a license, but to sell only 4G chips, not 5G. So the surprise here is that it's a 5G chip. And back to your earlier point at the start of this discussion, the thing that has not been officially confirmed by the company is that it's 5G. All the tests suggest that it is a 5G chip, but that's where the surprise really came in. It's like, oh, wait, where is this 5G chip coming from? They're supposed to only have 4G.
Okay, so if we're operating under the assumption that it is 5G, and we're operating under the assumption that SMIC or Huawei internally, someone's managed to contrive a way in order to produce these 5G chips, what impact does that have on anyone selling, and I'm talking about the likes of Apple, I'm talking about the likes of Samsung, of them selling phones into China? Because this should theoretically then be a game changer.
Yeah. And we do expect it to be a headwind for Apple in China. Apple does about $50 million a year in China. This could potentially add up to 10 million units of headwind for them on that. If Huawei is able to produce these, up to about 10 million units, obviously that takes away, that could be a direct impact to Apple, because particularly on the high end in China, if you're a consumer in the high end of China, you're looking at really just Apple versus Huawei as your main choices. And there are going to be users who say, okay, well, hey, I'm going to support the national champion. I'm going to get that Huawei device now that it is available and it is on 5G. And so that then becomes that impact to Apple.
No, but Apple is Apple.
Sure, and don't get me wrong, there's still the Apple loyalists and diehards in China.
Yeah.
And so it might not be that bad. This is kind of an extreme case that I'm putting up here.
But the reason why I ask is because, it's one thing if we were talking about headsets, but you've also got to think of it from the services perspective. Does Huawei have the infrastructure there on the services side to be able to then have people say, you know what, I'm going to eschew my Apple, even if I've got limited, operability in China with the App Store and everything else, but there is operability there. I'm going to put all of that aside and I'm going to buy this Mate 60. And I suppose that's the question that I'm also trying to get to. Are we there yet in terms of everything else they offer? Because it wasn't too long ago that, they don't have Google services or Android services on their phones as well.
Right, but don't forget, in China, Google services doesn't matter, right? So, and when we're talking about the bulk of their units being in China, basically WeChat, Tencent's WeChat becomes that interconnective layer instead. It's not so much about the Google services. So in this case, you will get users who, that basically that walled garden that Apple, that everybody's so envious of, is not as big of a factor in China as it is in other markets. And because of WeChat, users can easily move to another company. Now that said, Apple still has that brand cachet and that luster and that status symbol in China. So that is still a factor that will keep users with Apple.